Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're accessing this video. My name is Dr. Sarah Wall, and I am a senior lecturer in education at Anglia Ruskin University. It is my absolute pleasure to be asked to speak to you today. My specialisms are in special educational needs and disability, and I've previously worked as a specialist teacher for autism spectrum conditions and social, emotional and mental health needs. I've been a special educational needs coordinator and I'm a primary trained teacher. Today I'm going to talk to you about neurodiversity. So, when considering neurodiversity, we should first look at what that word means. It has two component parts, neuro and diversity. The first part, neuro, relates to neurology, and neurology has two definitions. The first definition relates to medicine, and the second relates to psychology. Medically, neurology is the study, diagnosis, and treatment of disorders of the nervous system. And the nervous system is made up of two parts. The central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes other sensory receptors, such as the ears, the eyes, etc. In psychological terms, neurology is concerned with cognition, the mental processes that take place in the brain, and these are invisible. And the second thing it's concerned with is behaviour, the action we engage in, what we can see, the visible part of what we do. So if we consider the second part of the word, diversity, it means diverse or varied. It was Judy Singer who came up with the word in 1999. Judy Singer is an Australian autism activist. She used the word as a shortened form of neurological diversity to describe how people think differently, they have different cognitive processes, and in turn behave differently, that we see different outward behaviours. She used the word because we talk about biodiversity. And so she decided to use the word in terms of humanity to describe that naturally we are neurologically diverse and that we should celebrate this diversity as we do in the environment as opposed to trying to eliminate it. On this slide, I've provided you with Judy Singer's website if you'd like to take a look. So when we talk about neurodiversity, there are many different terms that can be used, and we need to make sure that we use those in the correct way. So what I've done is I've put together a slide which explains those terms and gives you an example of where they might be used. So, for example, the first one, or two, because there's two and they can be used interchangeably with each other, is neurodivergent and neuroatypical. And neurodivergent is often abbreviated to ND. And what these two words do is describe brain functionality that diverges significantly, and that word's important. It diverges significantly from the typical. And we might use that word or those words to describe an individual. So, for example, Tom has dyslexia. He is neurodivergent or he is neuroatypical. The next word is neurodivergence, and this talks about where the neurology differs from the typical. And this term covers a range of different behavioural profiles. For example, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Tourette's syndrome, etc. And you might use that word in a sentence such as, this school understands how to support neurodivergence. The next one is neurodiverse, and it's an adjective and it describes populations. It doesn't describe individuals. So it describes those populations with different neurologies. So for example, the setting is neurodiverse rather than describing an individual person. We often have an opposite of ND, neurodivergent, in neurotypical, NT, the abbreviation. And this is used to describe non-neurodivergent individuals. And we might use that in a sentence such as, I am neurotypical. And the last one is neurominority. And this describes groups of neurodivergent people, e.g. autistic people are a neurominority. So on the previous slide, I began to talk about some neurodivergent conditions. So for example, I mentioned attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. I also mentioned dyslexia, I mentioned autism, and also Tourette's syndrome. Importantly, just kind of to note, some of those conditions, and particularly the last one, may be described in different ways in different countries, and indeed in the UK we would actually consider Tourette's syndrome with an apostrophe S as opposed to Tourette syndrome. So again, it's, depending on where you are, it's quite important to use the correct terminology. There are lots of other conditions. So for example, there I've got dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. My own background, my own PhD, is actually in working with individuals who have suffered trauma. So for example, neglect being one of them. And I've seen that the structure of their brains as well can also be changed, and so that they think differently, they behave differently. And so we also might consider conditions like reactive attachment disorder to be a neurological condition, and therefore we could call that a neurodivergent condition too. And that's important because there are conditions that we are potentially born with, like the ones I've just explained, but also there is acquired neurodivergence too. And so there are several conditions there. So for example, traumatic brain injury, post-stroke cognitive and communication difficulties, and post-traumatic stress disorder that can also be considered to be neurodivergent. So what are we talking about when we talk about prevalence of neurodiversity? Well, this is something that's quite difficult to ascertain. When I knew that I was going to do this presentation, put this together for you, I decided to do some research, and it became increasingly difficult to identify what we actually mean by the prevalence of neurodiversity and how many people that involves. And I think one of the issues around it is the kind of general definition of what neurodiversity is. Who are we actually talking about? And if you read different websites, they include different conditions. So even I've just spoken about how I feel perhaps that children with reactive attachment disorder, for example, could come under the umbrella of neurodiverse. And so that makes it very difficult to ascertain numbers. It also makes it very difficult because there aren't statistics, for example, for children or for young people or for adults. And so kind of untangling that web, as it were, is quite difficult. But there is one kind of key piece of information that I could find, and this was from Nancy Doyle, and she wrote a paper around neurodiversity at work. So here we are talking about adults, and she was talking about a biopsychosocial model of identifying neurodivergent individuals and how we could then support those individuals. And she states, given the extent of overlap between the conditions, the underdiagnosis of females who present with anxiety, depression, or eating disorders, and the estimated prevalence of each condition, a reasonable estimate of all neurominorities within the population is around 15 to 20%, i.e., a significant minority. So, what barriers to learning are there for a child or a young person who is neurodivergent? Well, I could probably do my presentation on just this alone and fill almost an hour, because there are so many different issues that might arise, and certainly this list is nowhere near exhaustive. But what I've tried to do is come up with the kind of most common things that happen, the most prevalent ones, and so I'll take you through each of those in turn. So the first one is an excessive curriculum content. So if there's an awful lot of material to learn, to process, to think about, that will cause a child or a young person considerable anxiety, because what it means is that they can't keep up. They can't keep up with their peers, and it causes them anxiety, it causes them stress. And actually studying excessively in this way can actually impact on their mental, their physical, or their sensory needs, and they may become overloaded. And actually we see that a lot with the barriers to learning. So the barriers to learning will arise from the fact that they have a different way of thinking, but actually what will then happen is it will impact on their emotional well-being. So we very often see children and young people, and indeed adults who are neurodivergent, having issues with their mental health. Another thing that may affect those who are neurodivergent is being very rigid in the classroom or being inflexible, and so sticking rigidly and adhering to those classroom practices in a particular way may be difficult for some neurodivergent individuals. What neurodivergent individuals are very good at is adapting, and so they will actually make their own way through the world. They'll come up with their own methods, they'll come up with their own way of doing things. And so actually when we ask them to be very rigid and do things in a particular way, that can be very confusing to them. It can be, again, very anxiety inducing and be very stressful for them. We may also see that neurodivergent individuals have a negative reaction to the environment, and this is often down to sensory needs. And we know that individuals such as autistic individuals have a negative experience in environments where perhaps there are fluorescent lights, loud noises, strong smells, uncomfortable uniform or furnishings, a lack of ventilation, clutter, over-decorated walls, etc. And actually the change in the diagnostic criteria for autism recently has highlighted the fact that sensory needs are really important to address for neurodivergent individuals. Another barrier may be a lack of breaks or a lack of a quiet space. So for example, individuals with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder may need those quiet times. They may need those breaks. Equally, autistic individuals may need space to stim. They might skip, they might hum. And what they do is they're emotionally regulating themselves. So if we don't give them that space and that time to do that, again, that will mean that they become anxious, that they become stressed, and that will impact on their mental health and well-being. Some changes to classroom practices can be good. They can be beneficial for individuals who are neurodivergent, particularly if they've been discussed with the individual themselves. However, if we change classroom practices and we do that last minute or very quickly, then that again can cause anxiety and stress, because, as I said previously, lots of neurodivergent individuals have their own systems. They've already worked out what works for them. They've got something in place and they're happily working their way through things by using those skills that they've developed. So if we change that at the last minute, it can be very stressful for them. Communication is another area that we really need to get right. Again, particularly for those people who are dyslexic, for example, we need to make sure that type and fonts are easy to read. We need to have clear instructions, because often these aren't clear and these are barriers, and they confuse individuals. So it's really useful to make sure that things are delivered in more than one way. The setting as a whole may need to be changed. There may be no signage. The layout might be illogical. We might have jargonistic labelling of rooms, for example. And again, all of those confuse, all of those increase anxiety and stress in neurodivergent individuals. When using computers, we need to think about screen glare. Again, we need to think about fonts and hard to read layouts too. And an overarching policy for neurodivergence is also quite useful, because if we don't have policies, we have individual students being treated differently by different staff. That leads to further confusion, because they don't know where they stand. One minute they go into one room and they're treated one way, the next minute they go into another room and they're treated another way, and they find that very difficult to work with. And they may be totally unaware of how to ask for support too, so those sorts of things need to be really clear. So when we're talking about neurodivergent individuals, those neurodivergent individuals might declare that they have a disability. And there are a couple of ways of looking at disability, and those two different ways are the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And I'm going to talk to you about both, starting with the medical model of disability. And what we do here is we consider that there are changes needed to the individual, and that we can support the individual by making adjustments. And you can see in this visual, this diagram, that very much it's the individual in this model that's the problem. We have a person in the circle and lots of arrows and the word problem around the outside. And this is a quite traditional view of disability, where disability is caused by the physical, the mental, or the sensory impairment of the individual, and that it's the individual who is impaired, and it's the individual that's the problem. And it's normally, traditionally, focused on the medical profession. Person goes to their GP and they get a diagnosis, whether that be of autism, whether that be ADHD, or any of the other conditions that I've already spoken to you about. And we focus on the medical profession alleviating the effect or trying to cure it, and those are some of the words that we hear used. And what this looks like when we apply the medical model is looking at reasonable adjustments that could be made to support the individual in the environment, changing something. For example, giving a student who has dyslexia a particular font, but we are focusing on that individual child or that young person, and we're making the change for them. So in comparison, we have here the social model of disability, and the social model of disability is around the fact that changes are needed in society. So we don't change the individual, we don't do things differently just for the individual. What we do is we change society, and in school or a setting, that would be to change the whole environment rather than just changing something for the child in particular. And we can see that here, instead of the arrows going into the person and conveying the fact that the person is the problem, the arrows are actually coming out of the person, and we're showing that there are barriers in society. So all of those things that we talked about a moment ago around the barriers to learning for individuals, that's how this is viewed in the social model of disability, that they are the things that are the social barriers, are things that are stopping individuals who are disabled, and in this particular case neurodivergent, from achieving their full potential. And the way in which those barriers occur is, as we've already said, through the environment. So the environment being inaccessible, so that might be the building, so it might not have ramps, for example, if it's a physical disability, but equally it might be that there's just lots of overload, sensory overload, lots of different colours, lots of bright lights, etc. Those sorts of things that we've already spoken about, which would be uncomfortable for individuals who were neurodivergent. It might be that services are inaccessible for individuals. It might be that the language is inaccessible, or it might be the communication is inaccessible. And the social model of disability also considers that there are attitudes that are barriers to individuals, in this case neurodivergent ones, and those attitudes are prejudice, stereotyping and discrimination. So for example, suggesting that all autistic individuals need the same, and they're all exactly the same, and they all behave in exactly the same way, which we know isn't actually correct. And there's a great saying that is, once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So those sorts of barriers, social barriers, are very much part of the social model of disability. And then we can also consider organisations and whether those organisations are inflexible in their procedures or their practices. So for example, if there is just one font that's available and every class teacher uses that font, but that font isn't accessible, then that's definitely a barrier. And so those two models are significantly different. So when we're looking at barriers to learning, we can look at these from either the perspective of the medical model of disability or the social model of disability. If we're looking at them in terms of the medical model of disability, we will be making a change that's relevant for the individual and that individual alone. If we're looking at the social model, we'll be making a change that's relevant for everyone, meaning that everyone can access whatever it is that we're providing. So, for example, with excessive curriculum content, what we might do for a neurodivergent individual in the medical model is to cut out some of that curriculum content. Maybe they only study English, maths, science, humanities, while other children and young people do all the other subjects. In the social model, though, we could be a little bit more creative, and we might say that we have all of these things on offer and children choose what they want to do and they sign up to different parts of the curriculum. And often that's what's needed if we're to actually implement the social model of disability rather than the medical one. We do need to come up with creative solutions. And I think that part of the reason why we haven't moved wholly from the medical model to the social model of disability is the fact that some of these solutions are challenging. We have to challenge our way of thinking. But what we need to try to do is make things accessible for everyone rather than changing something specifically. So again, for the rigid or inflexible classroom practices, it might be that you have a more open way of responding to things. So you might set more open-ended activities where children and young people can respond in the way that they want to. You might say something very simple like you can use a pencil or a paint or crayons or whatever, and then you might be dealing with sensory need too, because some children don't like to use certain medium. So again, it's about being more open, about using flexible approaches. With the distressing sensory environment, in the medical model, we would provide the neurodivergent individual with a space that's their own space where they could be calm, not anxious, not stressed. But again, we could think of more creative ways of addressing that, more ideas and ways that fit in with the social model. So for example, if there's a uniform, a school uniform, we could consider not having a school uniform. The children might be quite pleased about that. But then it would enable all of the children to wear whatever they want. And I do know lots of children who don't like to wear school uniform. It's the feel of individual jumpers or trousers or whatever it is on their skin, and particularly autistic individuals who find that very uncomfortable. So again, being creative, using different ways to make sure that everybody is involved and everybody's comfortable. For quiet space and breaks, we can make sure that all children and young people have access to those, not just those individuals who may have ADHD, like in this example, or maybe autistic. Maybe a quiet space with a reading corner or some lights or whatever it is that will meet the needs of the individuals in your class. Changing classroom practices. In a medical model, we might make sure that we give warning to those children, but ideally we would keep things quite systematic, quite the same, making sure that all children and young people know what they're doing and where they're going and the way things are done. We've mentioned communication with dyslexic people, and I'm hoping that this presentation has been addressed in an accessible way, and hopefully it's accessible to everybody. It's not got all singing, all dancing pictures, it's not got lots of different colours, it's not got films embedded and all of those sorts of things. So hopefully that has addressed that for everybody. Things like setting, design, signs, layout, labelling, those things can be made clear for everybody again. So it's a whole setting, a whole school, a whole institution approach to this. And that signage being in lots of different ways, like we might put up different languages. We might put up picture exchange communication system, pictures rather than words, for example. Computer use and layout, similar to those sorts of ideas that we talked about with communication, and again making sure that it's accessible for everyone. And if we have a school policy, or a whole setting, a whole institution policy, that needs to make sure that it's clear, it's readable for everybody, it's communicated effectively, and therefore children and young people who are neurodivergent will know that they're going to be treated the same in different situations with different members of staff, and they know how they can ask for support. So here we come on to what I'm really interested in terms of neurodivergence. The link between that and mental health and trauma. And as I've already said, you know that my PhD is in trauma, and I've worked with children who have been neglected, children who have been abused, and each of those experiences has been traumatic for them and has actually changed their brain structure so that, again, they think differently. It might be that those incidents aren't traumatic, and it depends upon the individual's response to that. But there are lots of different links between neurodiversity, mental health, and trauma. So, for example, a neurodivergent individual who has sensory needs, if their sensory needs aren't met, then they will consistently and repetitively have an experience that makes them feel unsafe, makes them feel fearful, uncomfortable, negative. And when that happens over and over and over again, that can cause trauma. So that very simple example that I gave previously about uniform, for example, if every single day you insist that an individual wears something specific, every single day, that child or young person, or even adults sometimes wear a uniform as well, is experiencing sensory trauma. And so we really have to consider that in terms of what we're asking our children and young people to do. Neurodivergent children and young people, and again indeed adults, can also experience this idea of feeling different. They may mask their neurodivergence. They may be bullied. They may be isolated. And again, each and every one of those experiences could be repetitive. It may be that it happens every day. I know certainly autistic individuals who have experienced significant issues with other peers. And so that can be, again, traumatic. And if you don't fit in, or you feel like you don't fit in, or something that you've been asked to do upsets you, causes you anxiety, and you don't comply, then sometimes that is met with maybe a sanction, a warning, a negative experience again. So again, we're just building on that experience that that individual has. The alternative is to celebrate that difference. Celebrate the fact that people think differently. Celebrate the fact that we all do things in a different way. And so therefore, that negative experience turns into a positive experience. And again, that's very much related to that social model of disability and the fact that we enable everybody to respond in the way in which they want to. There's also compliance trauma, which we've just tentatively talked about there, but this is particularly in relation to behaviour. So, for example, many autistic students have needs in the area of socialisation. So, for example, conversation might be difficult for them. And sometimes we try to make them do things in a particular way. And certainly things like social stories have been used where we try to kind of script what the individual is doing to make them behave in a particular way. And clearly there are behaviours that we cannot accept. So if a child is hurting another child, or a young person is hurting another child, or a child is hurting an adult, or a young person or an adult, or whatever it is, there are certain behaviours that we must address. But then there are other behaviours that we have to kind of think, well, do we really need to address that? Can that student still continue to behave in the way that they're behaving? Who is it actually challenging? And there's an interesting phrase that's been sort of recently adopted here in the UK around challenging behaviour or behaviour that challenges. And when we apply the phrase challenging behaviour, again, what we're doing is we're applying that medical model. The problem is within the child or the young person. But when we're using the term behaviour that challenges, we're talking about behaviour that challenges someone else. So we're thinking about that more in that kind of social model of disability. So it's really important to kind of think, what behaviours do we actually need to address and which behaviours don't we have to address? Because again, every time we address those, that's trying to ensure that that individual is being compliant, and it can lead to compliance trauma. We also have neurological trauma around communication and uncertainty. It's very anxiety provoking. Individuals are very worried about how they have to communicate. They might be uncertain about that. And that, again, that repetitive experience of not being understood, or that repetitive experience of changes being made, warnings not being given, again, can all lead to neurological trauma. And that can be from a number of professionals, or it can be from peers. And again, it's that idea of having to tell a story over and over and over again that sometimes happens with children and young people who have needs, and when their needs aren't met, or they're misunderstood, or they're misheard, or they're ignored, then again that can impact in terms of trauma. So that's why the last example here is specific to professionals. So that may be a speech and language professional, that may be a mental health professional. If that mental health professional doesn't understand the links between neurodiversity and mental health, you would hope that that wasn't the case. But these things do happen, and we do hear of stories where neurodivergent individuals have said that they're not being understood, they're not being heard, and they're being ignored. And here this moves us on to the idea of inclusion versus integration. And again, that whole idea of the social model versus the medical model. True inclusion, where we truly include children, we are adhering more to the social model of disability. When we're integrating them, we're adhering more to the medical model. And when we make these changes, for example, we meet individuals' sensory needs, we meet their needs so they don't feel like they are different, they don't need to mask, they're not bullied, they're not isolated, we don't expect them to comply all the time, we are very clear with our communication, and we listen, we understand. When we do all of those things, we are very much more in the realms of inclusive practice than we are in integration. Because when we're fully including them in society, the societal barriers are broken down. We're just not kind of integrating them, bolting them on and changing things specifically for them and them alone. And what's really, really important is that children cannot learn if they're traumatised. So if we're continuing to do these things and not meet their needs, then we're continually traumatising them and they will not be able to learn. So this is the final slide, and I have put together basically a solution in the social model to neurodivergence, and it's a suggestion for all schools and all settings, all institutions, and there are kind of 6 different areas, one being the curriculum, one being the premises, one being acceptance, one being communication, one being whole school provision, and the final one being about talking to the individual. And we've gone through lots of the examples of the first 5 already, and I'm sure that you can think of more yourselves. But the last one is really, really vital, and I can't emphasize enough that in my work as a specialist teacher, as a SENCO, as even a class teacher myself, often the issues were around a lack of communication. So communication is key. Talking to the parents, talking to the carers, talking to the individuals themselves. And that may seem like a cliche, but really when that is right, often things go fairly smoothly. And even if everything's not perfect, people will accept that people are trying. People are trying really hard to meet the need. If we don't listen, though, and people feel like they're ignored and they're not communicated with, then parents, carers, individuals then feel like their needs aren't being met, and that gets them anxious, that gets them concerned, that might get them angry. So that last one's really, really important, to listen, to talk, to keep that open dialogue going. And so I just really want to finish by saying thank you so much for listening to this presentation. Once again, saying thank you for asking me to present. It's an absolute pleasure. And if any of you would like to contact me, then please look me up on the Anglia Ruskin University website. I'm always contactable through email, and indeed I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to exchange ideas with you. I'd love to hear about you. You've all sat there listening to me and heard about me, but equally I'd love to hear about those of you who've listened to my presentation and what thoughts you have around neurodivergence. So please do get in touch, and I wish you the very best for the rest of the day.